Tonight, I have the great honor of introducing Yuri Herrera and Lisa Dillman to discuss 3 novels. Yuri Herrera studied politics in Mexico, creative writing in El Paso, and got his PhD in literature at Berkeley. His first novel to appear in English, Signs Preceding the End of the World, won the 2016 Best Translated Book Award and was chosen by The Guardian in 2019 as one of the 100 best books of the 21st century. He has gone on to become one of the best-loved and best-selling Mexican authors published in translation. His latest book in English is A Silent Fury, The El Bordo Mine Fire. Also published by Another Stories, it is his first work of nonfiction. He currently teaches at Tulane University in New Orleans. Lisa Dillman has translated a number of Spanish and Latin American writers. Some of her recent translations include A Luminous Republic by Andres Barba, The Bitch by Pilar Quintana, and Yuri Herrera's 4 books. She is currently at work on 10 Planets, his 5th. She won the 2016 Best Translated Book Award as the translator of Signs Preceding the End of the World, and teaches in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. And tonight's moderator, Betina González, is an Argentine fiction writer. She holds a PhD in Hispanic Literatures from the University of Pittsburgh and an MFA in Bilingual Creative Writing from the University of Texas at El Paso. She teaches creative writing at New York University in Buenos Aires and the University of Buenos Aires. Her first work published in English is American Delirium, translated by Heather Cleary. I'm so thrilled to have them here together in conversation. And now Yuri, Lisa, and Betina.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here with us.
Welcome. I believe we are going to start by doing a reading, right? A bilingual reading?
Yeah, well, usually when I am doing readings by myself in English, I always start by apologizing for slaughtering the beautiful translations that Lisa has done of my books. But since she's here tonight and she's gonna do the second and third one, I'm not gonna over-apologize. What I'm gonna read is just the first 2 pages or the first chapter of Kingdom Cons, which is my first novel, even though it is the second one that appeared in English. So it's like this. He knew blood and could see this man's was different. Could see it in the way he filled the space, without no urgency and an all-knowing air, as though made of finer threads, other blood. The man took a seat at the table and his attendants fanned out in a semicircle behind him. Lobo admired him in the waning light of the day that filtered in through a small window on the wall. He had never had these people close, but was sure he'd seen this scene before. The respect this man and his companions inspired in him had been set out somewhere, the sudden sense of importance he got on finding himself so close. He recognized the way the man sat, the lofty look, the glimmer. Then he saw the jewels that graced him and knew he was a king. The one time Lobo had gone to the pictures, he saw a movie with a man like this, strong, sumptuous, dominating the things of the world. He was a king, and around him, everything became meaningful. Men gave their lives for him. Women gave birth for him. He protected and bestowed, and in the kingdom, through his grace, each and every subject had a precise place. But those accompanying this king were more than vassals. This was his court. Lobo felt envy, the bad kind first and the good kind after, because suddenly he saw that this was the most important day of his life. Never before had he been near one of those who gave life meaning, made it all tally up. Never even had the hope. Ever since his parents had brought him here from who knows where and then abandoned him to his fate, life had been a counting of days and dust and sun. A voice thick with phlegm distracted his gaze from the king, a drunk ordering him to sing. Lobo complied, effortlessly at first, still trembling with excitement, but soon, from the same, he sang like never before. pulling words out from inside as though pronouncing them for the first time, as though overcome by the ecstasy of having happened upon them. He felt the king's eyes on his back, and the cantina fell silent. People put their dominoes face down on tables to listen. He sang a song, and the drunk demanded another, and then another, and another, and another. And with each one, Lobo sang more inspired, and the drunk got more drunk. At times, he joined in. At times, he spat into the sawdust and laughed with the old folk that were there with him. Finally, he said, "Okay," and Lobo held out his hand. The drunk paid, and Lobo saw that it was short and held out his hand once more. "That's it, songbird. What I got left is for one more shot. Just thank your saints you got that much." Lobo was used to it. These things happened. And he was about to turn away in what can you do resignation when he heard from behind, "Pay the artist." Lobo turned to see the king holding the drunk in his gaze. He said it calm. It was a simple order, but the man didn't know enough to stop. "What artist?" he said. "Only thing I see here is this fool, and I already paid him." "Don't get smart, friend," the king's voice hardened. "Pay him and shut it." The drunk got up and staggered to the king's table. His men went on alert, but the king sat unflustered. The drunk struggled to focus and then said, "I know you. I heard what they say." "That a fact? And what do they say?" The drunk laughed, clumsily scratched a cheek. "Nah, not your business I'm talking about. Everybody knows that." "Talking about the other." And he laughed once more. The king's face clouded. He tilted his head back, got up, signaled his entourage to stay put, approached the drunk and grabbed his chin. The man tried to twist free, no luck. The king put his lips to the drunk's ear and said, "Actually, I don't think you heard a thing. You know why? Because dead men have very poor hearing." The king put his gun to him as though filling the man's gut and fired. A simple shot, nonchalant. The drunk opened his eyes wide, tried to steady himself on a table, slipped and fell. The king turned to the bruiser with him. "You got something to say too?" The man snatched his hat and fled, hands high in a "I didn't see a thing." The king bent over the corpse, rifled through a pocket, pulled out a wad of bills. He peeled off a few, handed them to Lobo, replaced the rest. "Artist, take your due," he said. Lobo took the bills without looking down. He was staring at the king, drinking him in, and kept watching as the king signaled his crew and they filed slowly out of the cantina. Lobo gazed at the swinging doors and thought that from now on there was a new reason why calendars were senseless. No date meant a thing besides this one, because finally he'd found his place in the world, and because he heard something about a secret which he damned well wanted to keep. Thank you.
Great. What a powerful beginning for a novel. So I'm going to let you rest for just a second, and I'm going to ask Lisa a question, okay? So, Lisa, for me, Yuri is a writer that aims to universality by being local. How do you translate that? Because we heard that powerful beginning and we can see that, right? That locality, but at the same time, universality. So what was the main challenge for you to translate that?
That's a really good question. And I think it's a very delicate balance between trying to localize language and trying to keep it more general, right? And I think in the Spanish, the Spanish can be as local as it wants, right? And it can be many different types of local, perhaps, at the same time, whether those be temporal, whether it be older language, whether it be more sort of borders language, whether it be slang. But when it comes to putting those things into English, there is the potential pitfall of, if you localize the language, how do you localize it? And for me, there's not a right answer to that question. I think most translators have a barrage of strategies and tools that they use for dealing with localized language, and maybe not the same answer works in every situation. But for me, particularly with Yuri, I find that I want to find ways generally to lower the register, to make the language be a bit more infused with orality, but not to be geographically locatable in a sense, because you have the problem of equivalence, right? Which is a big deal in translation, right? What does it mean to be equivalent? And can you say that, Lobo, for example, a kid speaking Mexican Spanish, what locality does that equate to in English, right? How do you say, oh, that's Southern, oh, that's New York English, right? And so that feels to me to be an injustice, to try to claim some kind of mutual exchangeability in that sense. So my strategies revolve around small, subtle lexical moves that might infuse the prose with familiarity, with a colloquial element, things, for example, that might involve dropping a subject pronoun, whereas in English, we normally don't do that, dropping definite articles, whereas in English, we normally don't do that, to just add a greater sense of orality and familiarity, and sometimes affection, but also sometimes rancor, but emotion, without fixing it in a particular place, I think.
Interesting, because I read some fragments of your translation, and it's beautifully done. And I think you capture what Yuri does in Spanish, which is a pretty difficult thing to do, to write a novel that is realistic and non-realistic at the same time, right? Create its own language and its own space. So Yuri, I would say that you are a very universal writer, and you work with local speech, but at the same time you work with archetypes. Sometimes when I read you, your writing reminds me of Rulfo or Borges, right? So are those influences for you? Were those important writers?
Well, I hope so. The issue of the influences, it's very often more a conversation about desire than about what it really is. I always say that we can say that we have the influence of Shakespeare, or we have the influence of Garcia Marquez or Rulfo, but very often we are not recognizing the influence of the Simpsons, for instance, or the influence. I think a lot about my cousins in Pachuca that were a sort of a very important linguistic influence for me. When I was growing up and just listening to them, who were just kids, but for me were big people, and they had a really foul language, but it was so powerful. That was very important for me. As for the let's say the regular established writers, yeah, well, Rulfo and Borges are two writers that I have read constantly and repeatedly, and I have used them in class, and I have studied them by myself. But I always think that there are also other influences that maybe I would like them to be part of my influence curriculum, but I don't know if they are. I think of Mercè Rodoreda, a Catalan writer who wrote what is for me one of the most perfect novels in the 20th century, La Plaza del Diamante, which I think in English is translated In the Time of the Doves. Lisa, you should know because you translated also some Rodoreda, no?
It is In the Time of the Doves, yeah.
Yeah. And also something that I read and I come back again and again is the American noir novel, that for me it's an important model in terms of how to tell a story in terms of how to tell the story of a crime in political terms without talking about politics, and also how to make the rhythm of the story to be dependent in a way in the orality of the characters, how the characters are imprinting what is happening in there. So yeah, well, we can just keep talking about the influences or what we want, what we wish to there are influences to be, but yeah, you're right about those two.
Okay, cool. And it's always nice to be right. Despite all those influences, despite all this reading, and you know, being a participant of many literary traditions, you have been defined as a border writer, especially at the beginning of your career. Now, I don't think the critics are saying that much. How do you feel about that? And, you know, how you will define yourself, if you have any definition?
Well, when you mentioned the border writer, the way that people talked about that was about writing about the border, and actually, I like more the idea of a border writer, like you are
right in the border.
Yeah, in between sanity and insanity, in between languages, in between places. I like that, and that's what I call the border condition, which is the way in which migrant people live, even though they are not at the actual border, because they are always in between rules, in between realities, in between languages, and that is something that I aspire to learn from migrants. But as for the tag, as for the border writer thing that where you can find maybe my books in some bookstores, sometimes at the beginning it was a little bit annoying, because you don't aspire to be just a brand or a tag. But it is useful in academic terms. It is useful for in the bookstores. And what I was trusting, and I think it happened eventually, is that would change. That was just attached to what was happening with my first two books, especially with Kingdom Cons. All these things are really ephemeral in that sense. So I'm okay. This is that's not the only tag that has been attached to me. I have been called also a narco writer, which is really weird. It's as if I had a yacht or something like that, and bodyguards.
We know you do. We know you have a yacht.
Yeah, they are here outside this room. But so those things disappear if you just keep working. You know?
Yes. But you are a Mexican writer living in the US. That's another tag right there, right? How do you feel about that? What impact do you feel that American culture had on your writing, and especially on your daily life?
Well, I have lived in very, very different places in the United States. I lived in El Paso, then I lived in Berkeley, then I live in Charlotte in North Carolina, and now I live in New Orleans. And these four places are as different as they can be in the geography of the city, in the life that you find in them, in the place each one of them has in the imaginary of American culture. What I would say is that even though in each place I have made a life, and I have friends and relations and work and enemies, which I always say that is the most important thing that you should have in a place if you belong to that place. Even with all these things, I always live a sort of isolated life. And so it's a kind of a schizophrenic thing. I know I shouldn't use this word because it's not precise, but just in the sense that I'm always thinking in terms of Mexican language, in terms of Mexican characters, in terms of my dialogue with Mexico. And at the same time, there is something that the daily life here is giving me in different ways. Nowadays, I would say that New Orleans is one of those places that is at the same time gives you space to create, but it also, if you want, it can distract you a lot. But it's a really generous city. It's a city that is used to be rebuilt and rebuilt and rebuilt again and again and again. It's a city where the floor is always moving because it's built on top of a swamp, you know. I think that is part of very important part of New Orleans, which is a creative spirit and a creative energy that you rarely see in any other place.
Yeah, it's an amazing city. But specifically about English, do you feel that living in another language and speaking and, you know, thinking and dreaming in another language has an impact on your Spanish?
I hope so. Also, you know, if there is something I don't believe in, is the purity of language. Languages are changing all the time. They are changing by the influence of the social networks you're in, the influence of the lovers you have, the influence of the people you hear on the street. So I don't think the English has had an impact in terms of the grammar, in terms of the structures of the Spanish language, if it's not on purpose. But I think it must have had a certain influence, sometimes in terms of the cadence of how I write, and sometimes in terms of how I question my use of certain words and certain expressions in English, that once you are living in a different language, you have the opportunity to look at them under a new light. Every new language is a new light that helps you see everything anew, including your native language. You know?
Yeah, I agree. And that takes me to another question for Lisa. How was the translation process like? Did you work closely with Yuri, or did he didn't interfere with your work?
Yes, I probably worked annoyingly closely with with Yuri. This is another thing that I think, you know, all translators have their kind of MO, and mine tends to be that if the writer I'm working with is alive and if they are amenable to it, I do like to be in touch with them. And because Yuri's texts are so dense in so many ways, they pack so much into such short novels. I started translating Kingdom Cons first. And that was actually, I know because I was just looking this up for another purpose, but that was actually in 2009 that I first did a sample of the book. It wasn't the book. Sent Yuri a few questions. His email was provided to me. I sent him a few questions. He answered so generously that it was like a drug. So more and more and more and more. And throughout essentially all of the books that I've done with Yuri, I am in very close contact. Sometimes multiple emails in a single day. Sometimes up to maybe 8 or 10 different queries in a single email. And then also, when possible, we have met in person, occasional Zoom, this sort of thing. But you said something about, did he interfere, or how closely was he involved? And this is interesting and not typical in my experience, is that Yuri very, very generously is willing to go into great detail on questions that can be about anything. It can be about, so this is a word, this is a yurismo, right? This is something you made up, right?
I love it.
I would generally see what do I not have to bother him with, right? What can I do on myself? What can I do myself first? And you check multiple dictionaries, there's nothing there. And then oftentimes I have the experience of I Google a word or a phrase and I get 8 hits and I'm like, yes, I'm going to find it. And it turns out that all 8 of them are people quoting that exact line from the novel.
Of course. That's interesting. It's interesting because he works a lot with neologism. He creates words, right?
Yes, I've noticed that.
Tricky. Even in Spanish, you have to use the dictionary and look for, where he set the trap for you. So Yuri, I read in an interview that you like to make lists of words that you won't allow yourself to use in your novels, and other words that you would like to use. So I'm curious, how do you manage that? And I'm also curious if you share that with Lisa. I mean, that those words that were important for you in Spanish, looking for equivalents or ways to translate those words into English or expressions into English.
Yeah, the list of words not to use was especially important with my first novel, which is a novel that happens in the border and happens where there's a criminal organization, and it's a border between the United States and Mexico, and very likely they are making money with drugs. So I decided not to use the word border or Mexico or United States or drugs or cartel, because what I didn't want was those words to do the job of the reader. Because very often when we find some words, we think that we understand what the whole thing is about because these words have so much weight. So this is something that I have been doing with the other books, but it was especially important with that one. But what I enjoy more is the words that I want to use. And those are different reasons. Very often, I don't know the reason. It's just some word that I hear and that I thought that it could be, that it could fit whatever I'm writing. And eventually, I will find the reason why it is. Because maybe you know this, I'm sure you know, because I mean, every person has a different process. But you, at the beginning, at least I at the beginning, have a certain impulse of where I'm going. And there are things that sound right, and there are things that does not sound right, even when you are not that clear about the path that you're taking. And these lists of words help me a lot to start finding what are some things that I want to say, but also the joy of saying it, and very often in the way songs are written, or a way at least in the way I have tried to write songs, that you do it around a word that you like. You make the other words work for it. And I tend to share this with Lisa because it is like an important clue to where you are going, even if you are not sure where you are going. So I'm going to say just a couple of words, for instance, that I have been writing for the novel that I'm planning right now, that it's a novel about the time Benito Juarez, the would-be president of Mexico, spent exiled in New Orleans. I found this word, I don't even know where I found it, called susulto. Have you heard this?
Of course not.
Susulto is like when you jump, when you are asleep and you jump, like, and that is susulto. I plan to use a lot the word tlacuache, which is the Nahua word for opossum. There is a fish that can be found in the Gulf, whose name is pampano. I just think it's an extremely beautiful word. And another one, I think this already shared with you, Lisa. I saw it in a letter that Benito Juarez is sending to someone, and he's talking about the calligraphy that he found in this letter. And he said, it's an arrogant calligraphy. And I thought that was the most beautiful way.
An adjective for a calligraphy. Perfect.
So it's different reasons. Sometimes it's just a word that is being bold and it's being adventurous. Sometimes it's a word that synthesizes something that you're trying to say, sometimes it's a word that it just sounds really good.
So be ready for the challenge, Lisa, for this new novel, right? And the list of words. And one thing I read that you said, Yuri, that it is related to this is that you create these words or you create these restrictions for yourself in order to force the reader to face the cliche of massive media language, right? To waken the reader to the things that are happening in the novel and also in her reality, right? So am I correct? It's one of the objectives.
Well, in general, I think that's what literature does. I'm always discussing why I don't get I don't share the passion that feels really outdated for what some people call experimental literature. I think literature is always experimental.
Of course.
If it's not experimental, then it's just an instruction manual, you know. Literature is always trying to find new ways to talk about things, and sometimes especially to talk about the things that have been so discussed so much in a superficial way in the mass media or from the powerful people. So I think literature is always offering an opportunity to the readers to rethink intimate things and very public things.
Interesting. I have a lot of more questions, but we want to do a second reading, right? So
yeah.
Go for it.
This one we are doing it in Spanish and English. Do you want to go first, Lisa?
Sure. Yeah, this is from Science Preceding the End of the World, chapter 8. She'd already left the barracks when she heard, "You two, assume the position, you two." She turned and saw a horribly pasty policeman pointing at her. "Are you deaf? Get in line." In a vacant lot pooled with black water were half a dozen men on their knees, staring at the ground. They all were or looked homegrown. Makina took her place beside them. "You think you can just come here and put your feet up without earning it?" said the cop. "Well, I got news for you. Patriots like me are on the lookout, and we're going to teach you some manners. Lesson 1, get used to falling in. You want to come here? Fall in and ask permission. You want to go to the doctor? Fall in and ask permission. You want to say a fucking word to me? Fall in and ask permission. Fall in and ask permission. Civilized, that's the way we do things around here. We don't jump fences and we don't dig tunnels." Out of the corner of her eye, Makina could see the cop's tongue poking out as he talked, all pink and pointy. She could see, too, that even though he didn't draw, he also didn't take his hand off the holster where his gun was. Suddenly, the cop addressed one of the others, the one beside her. "What you got there?" He took 2 steps toward him and repeated, "What you got there?" The man was holding a little book and gripped it tighter when the cop came close. He resisted a bit, but finally let him snatch it away. "Ha," said the cop, glancing at it. "Poetry. Looky here at the educated worker. Comes with no money, no papers, but hey, poems. You a romantic, a poet, a writer? Looks like we're going to find out." He ripped out one of the last pages, laid it on the book's cover, pulled a pencil from his shirt, and gave it to the man. "Write." The man looked up, bewildered. "I told you to write, not look at me, you piece of shit. Keep your eyes on the paper and write why you think you're up the creek. Why you think your ass is in the hands of this patriotic officer. Or don't you know what you did wrong? Sure you do. Write." The man pressed the pencil to the paper and began to trace a letter, but his trembling prevented him. He dropped the pencil, picked it up, tried again. He couldn't compose a single word, just nervous scribble. Makina suddenly snatched the pencil and book away. The cop roared, "I didn't tell you to," but he fell silent on seeing that Makina had begun to write with determination. He kept a close watch on her progress, smiling and sardonic the whole time, though he was disconcerted and couldn't hide it. Makina wrote without stopping to think which word was better than which other or how the message was turning out. She wrote 10 lines, and when she was done, she placed the pencil on the book and fixed her gaze upon it. The cop waited a few seconds, then said, "Give me that," took the sheet of paper and began to read aloud. "We are to blame for this destruction. We who don't speak your tongue and don't know how to keep quiet either. We who didn't come by boat, who dirty up your doorsteps with our dust, who break your barbed wire. We who came to take your jobs, who dream of wiping your shit, who long to work all hours. We who fill your shiny, clean streets with the smell of food, who brought you violence you'd never known, who deliver your dope, who deserve to be chained by neck and feet. We who were happy to die for you. What else could we do? We, the ones who are waiting for who knows what. We, the dark, the short, the greasy, the shifty, the fat, the anemic. We, the barbarians." The cop had started off in a mock portentous voice, but gradually abandoned the histrionics as he neared the last line, which he read almost in a whisper. After that, he went on staring at the paper as if he'd gotten stuck on the final period. When he finally looked up, his rage or his interest in his captives seemed to have dissolved. He crumpled the paper into a ball and tossed it behind him. Then he looked away, turned his back, spoke over the radio to someone, and took off. Makina stood as soon as the cop had gone, but the others took some time to realize that they weren't under arrest. They looked at one another, half glad, half mistrustful, then looked at Makina, but couldn't say anything to her because she started walking again, and all they could make out was her silhouette against the sun.
Thank you, Lisa. So this is it in Spanish. Y había dejado atrás el cuartel cuando escuchó: "Tú también, adopta la posición, tú también". Giró la cabeza y vio que un policía horriblemente pálido la señalaba con un dedo. ¿Estás sorda? Ponte en fila. En un lote baldío y encharcado de agua negra había media docena de hombres de rodillas y mirando al suelo. Todos eran o parecían paisanos. Makina tomó su lugar al lado de ellos. «Así que piensan que pueden venir y ponerse cómodos sin ganárselo», dijo el policía. «Pues les tengo noticias. Hay patriotas que estamos vigilando y les vamos a dar una lección. Esta es la primera. Acostúmbrense a estar en fila. Si quieren venir, se forman y piden permiso. Si quieren ir al médico, se forman y piden permiso. Si quieren dirigirme la puta palabra, se forman y piden permiso. Se forman y piden permiso. Así hacemos las cosas aquí, la gente civilizada, no brincándonos bardas ni haciendo túneles». Por el rabillo del ojo, Makina veía cómo asomaba la lengua del policía al hablar, muy rosada y puntiaguda. Veía también que, aunque no la sacara, no separaba una mano de la funda donde traía la pistola. De pronto, el policía se dirigió a uno de los otros, el que estaba al lado de ella. «¿Qué traes ahí?» Dio 2 pasos hacia él y repitió: «¿Qué traes ahí?» El hombre tenía entre sus manos un libro pequeñito y lo apretó cuando el policía se aproximó a él. Se resistió un poco, pero finalmente dejó que se lo arrebatara. «Ah», dijo el policía tras hojearlo, «poemas. Vaya con la mano de obra calificada. No traen dinero, no traen documentos, pero traen poemas. ¿Eres muy romántico? ¿Eres poeta? ¿Eres escritor? Pues ahora vamos a ver». Arrancó una de las últimas hojas, la apoyó en la pasta del libro, sacó un lápiz de su camisa y le dio todo al hombre. «Escribe». El hombre levantó la mirada sin entender de qué se trataba. «Te dije que escribieras, no que me miraras, hijo de puta. Pon los ojos en el papel y escribe por qué crees que estás en la mierda. ¿Por qué crees que tu culo está en las manos de este oficial patriota? ¿O no sabes que has hecho mal? Sí lo sabes. Escribe». El hombre apoyó el lápiz en la hoja y comenzó a trazar una letra, pero el temblor se lo impidió. Dejó caer el lápiz, lo levantó y volvió a intentarlo. No alcanzó a anotar ni una palabra, solo un garabato nervioso. Makina le arrebató súbitamente el lápiz y el libro. El policía gritó: «A ti no te dije que...». Pero se calló al ver que Makina comenzó a escribir sin titubeos. La vigiló mientras lo hacía todo el tiempo sonriendo sardónicamente, aunque no podía ocultar desconcierto. McKean escribió sin detenerse a pensar cuál palabra era mejor que otra o cómo sonaba el mensaje. Escribió 10 líneas y al terminar colocó el lápiz sobre el libro y en él detuvo su mirada. El policía aguardó unos segundos. Luego dijo, dame eso. Cogió la hoja y comenzó a leer en voz alta. Nosotros somos los culpables de esta destrucción. Los que no hablamos su lengua ni sabemos estar en silencio. Los que no llegamos en barco. Los que ensuciamos de polvo sus portales. Los que rompemos sus alambradas. Los que venimos a quitarles el trabajo. Los que aspiramos a limpiar su mierda. Los que anhelamos trabajar a deshoras. Los que llenamos de olor a comida sus calles tan limpias. Los que les trajimos violencia que no conocían. Los que transportamos sus remedios. Los que merecemos ser amarrados del cuello y de los pies. Nosotros, a los que no nos importa morir por ustedes. ¿Cómo podría ser de otro modo? Los que quién sabe qué aguardamos. Nosotros los oscuros, los chaparros, los grasientos, los mustios, los obesos, los anémicos. Nosotros, los bárbaros. El policía había comenzado la lectura engolando la voz, pero fue perdiendo histrionismo conforme se acercaba a la última línea, que leyó casi en un susurro. Al terminar, se quedó mirando la hoja como si se hubiera atorado en el punto final. Cuando por fin levantó la vista, parecía haber perdido la rabia o el interés en sus prisioneros. Redujo el papel a un bollo y lo arrojó a sus espaldas. Luego miró hacia otra parte, se dio media vuelta, habló con alguien por su radio y se largó. McKean se puso de pie en cuanto el policía se hubo ido, pero los demás tardaron en reparar que no se los llevarían presos. Se miraron unos a otros entre contentos y desconfiados. Miraron luego a McKean, pero ya no le pudieron decir nada porque ella había echado a andar de nuevo y solo alcanzaron a divisar su silueta recortada contra el sol.
Wow. You read one of my favorite passages from that novel. It's so poetic what she writes, right? Do you remember when you write this? The exact moment when you were writing it?
What I knew that I didn't know the words when before writing it, but I knew two things. And I knew the kind of dramatic impact that it had to have, that it had to be like a confrontation with the policeman without confronting him, but taking his own arguments to an absurd extreme. And I knew the cadence that it had to have. I knew that it had to all sound almost like a sort of religious prayer. That is something that I had really clear.
Yeah, I remember in an interview you said you read the Bible for inspiration, like Whitman. I was surprised to read that. Would you like to comment on that?
No, just I used to be a really good reader of the Bible, even though I'm a big sinner, or maybe because of that. But I don't know. It's one of those books that you never stop reading, even when you think that you're doing it. You just keep getting back to it, and in that way, it's a good model for any other book.
We don't have a lot of time left, and we want to listen to a passage from the Transmigración. Do you want to read it so we can open the room for questions from the audience?
Yeah, I would, if possible. I would love it if Lisa could read that passage. Yeah,
sure. I'll read a very, very short passage from Transmigration. It's less than a page. Okay. For the past 4 days, the message had been, stay calm, everybody calm, this is not a big deal. On a bus, he himself had witnessed the pseudo-calm of skepticism. A street peddler had boarded the bus, selling bottles of bubble gel. He blew into a plastic ring, and little solar systems sailed down the aisle, oscillating, suspended, landing on people without bursting. Gel bubbles, he said, last far longer than soap bubbles. You can play with them. And he took a few between his fingers, jiggled, pressed, and puffed. One popped on a man's forehead, and just then the penny dropped. The bubble was full of air and spit from a stranger's mouth. A rictus of icy panic spread across the passengers' faces. The man got up and said, get the fuck off. The peddler stammered, "What's the problem, friend? No need to act like that." But the guy was already on him. When the guy lifted him up by his sweater, the bus driver slowed just a bit and opened the doors so the vendor and his bottles could be tossed to the curb. Then he closed the doors and sped back up, and no one said a word, not even him. But at the time, they could still think they'd escaped the danger. Last night's news was no longer a dodge. The story had been picked up everywhere. 2 men in a restaurant, total strangers, started spitting blood almost simultaneously and collapsed over their tables. That was when the government came out and admitted, "We believe the epidemic," and that was the first time they'd used the word, "may be a tad more aggressive than we'd initially thought. We believe it can only be transmitted by mosquitoes, Egyptian mosquitoes," they underscored. "Though there have been a couple of cases that appear to have been spread by other means. So while we're ruling out whatever we can rule out, it's best to stop everything, though really there's no cause for concern. We have the best and brightest tracking down whatever this is. And of course we have hospitals too, but just in case, best to stay home and not kiss anybody and touch anybody and cover your nose and your mouth and report any symptoms. But the main thing is stay calm," which logically was taken to mean lock yourself up or this fucker will take you down because we have unleashed some serious wrath.
I'm sorry, Yuri, I have to ask this question. I'm sure you're tired of hearing this, but you feel that your writing here was somehow foretelling what is happening now with the COVID pandemic?
Well, what I always think is that literature does not foretell, but I think what literature does is put together some things that are in the world and that we see isolated. And that's why sometimes it feels like we are anticipating stuff. But I think it has to do with the attention with which we can look at the world sometimes. And even before the pandemic, there were things happening in the world, in the way we face natural disasters, in the way we face catastrophes that somehow anticipated what we are living today. Thank you.
Well, Pierce, do you want to open the room for questions from the audience? Because we have just 5 minutes left.
Yeah, I'm here. We've got a couple questions. We'll see how quickly we can get through them. Thank you, everyone. This has just been incredible. Yuri, this first one is for you. It's from Julie. Julie says, there are a lot of writings about the process of the translator. I would love to hear about the process of the author during that translation collaboration and what it was like working with Lisa.
Well, it was absolutely great. Lisa didn't finish before. I don't know if she wants to finish, but when she was asked if I interfere, I feel that I don't interfere. I feel that we collaborate a lot. I tried not to be a micromanager. I collaborate as much as the translator wants. And with Lisa, it has been a very, very close relation. Yes, recently, a friend of mine, she was doing a dissertation about the translation of several books. And she asked me about the process with Lisa. And I shared with her a lot of emails from when we just started collaborating. And I love how you can see in those emails how the process was changing and becoming more rich and becoming like a really intimate relation and a really creative relationship. What I always say is that the translation from the author's point of view is just about letting it go. It's a step into the abyss and you have to embrace it. You have to trust that the translator knows the language much better than what you think that you know that language. And Lisa is a creator herself. She is not just a translator in the sense that some people understand translation as transcribing, but it's recreation, it's rewriting. And I trust absolutely Lisa with this. I know that my text sometimes can be very difficult to translate, and she always finds a solution that is satisfactory for everyone.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, Do you write with a specific reader or audience in mind? Does a translated edition change or conflict with your original sense of your reader or listener? Yuri, would you like to start?
It's two different questions. The first one is that no, I don't have a very specific reader. Maybe the only occasion in which I have had specific readers is the 2 times when I wrote short stories for children. Mm-hmm. I was thinking in my nieces and nephews, and that was a very specific thing. Besides that, maybe in a very broad, general way, I'm thinking about the Mexican readership, but I can't assume that I know that public either. It's just what I'm imagining that they are. And as if it changes with each translation, of course, that's if we are fortunate enough, that's what should happen with every book, that it keeps acquiring new meanings, that it keeps acquiring new senses, new ways of dwelling in the world that you were not anticipating. If a book only does what you thought at the beginning that it was going to do, then it's not a book, but it's just a rock. You know?
Lisa, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I guess I feel like it's a very tricky thing to talk about because people have in their brains always a kind of what has been called in translation studies sort of like a rhetoric of loss, right? Which is this conception that if there's not one precise word that can be absolutely substituted for one other precise word, which of course the initial word is full of connotations and resonances and things that relate to the cultural knowledge of the original readership. And so by definition, you know, when you translate a word, when you carry it across, you're forcing it into a new context. You're forcing it into a situation whereby the second readership, by definition, will not have the same frames of reference, the same familiarities. So I think it's tricky to talk about because people think in terms of loss, and I think it's very beautiful the way Yuri talks about it as a gain, right? As acquiring something new. And I personally am very aligned with more recent perspectives in translation studies and translation, which would view translation as sort of an iteration, mm-hmm. And not pretending to view it as some transfer that can possibly happen innocently. It can never be innocent.
Thank you both. And then, Yuri, can you talk about how you name your characters?
Well, it's not always the same process. It depends on the project I'm in. I would say that one of the things in general has to do with how those characters create certain expectations, and they are a point of reference, and they create certain tension in the story. So you play with that. You play with the expectations that the name is created. If you have a character that is called Jesus Christ, that character is creating a certain expectation. Yeah, I'm just giving a really, really cheap, really explicit example of one of the ways in which this can be done. But there are other cases in which it has to do with a physical feature, or it has to do with a certain way of relating to other characters. I think a lot about this because I myself have a problematic name. I am named after a Soviet cosmonaut, and when I was growing up in Mexico, this was the name of a female singer that she changed her name from Yuridia to Yuri. So that really messed with my mind when I was growing up as a teenager. But I think that was a good thing. We were talking just about this before we started. You peers, you also get this a lot, that people think that they are going to talk to a guy and they are talking to you. The same thing happens to me in the opposite. So I know that every name creates certain expectations. Every name is a sort of baggage, and also every name is an opportunity to do something to defy those expectations. So I don't like to think as the names just as placeholders or GPS coordinates, you know, but active words that are doing something within the story.
Thank you. We have two that we'll just try to squeeze in from Jay. First, Jay asks, will we ever get an edition of Yuri's novels that include both original and English texts? I've had to buy them separately over the years. Yuri, I don't know if you have the answer to that question.
If there is a novel with both, an edition with both in English and Spanish?
Yeah, a bilingual edition.
No, there is no bilingual edition. I actually have not thought about it before this today. Well, let's just send this to our publishers. And by the way, I just wanted to thank our publishers in other stories that have been so generous with our work, and that decided to publish this omnibus edition as the 100th title that they are publishing since they started. So anyway, no commitments, no pressure on the bilingual edition, but there's an idea.
It is beautiful. I don't know if you've all seen it yet. It is an absolutely beautiful collected edition. Lovely. And then this last one is a little long. The brother in Signs is one of the most interesting characters I've ever encountered. As a child of immigrants, I still struggle with identity. American, Ecuadorian, American, etc., etc. I still debate the brother's decision to stay and not return home. Is it selfish, independence? Has he evolved or turned his back on his past? What motivated her brother?
Well, it can be all of those things at the same time, and it can be something different. I actually heard this story of a guy, a person that went through something like this from my aunt Esther, who is one of the persons to whom I dedicate this novel. And she was a primary school teacher, and when one of her students was a teenager, he just disappeared. He went to work at the United States and came back like 15, 20 years later, and he had a different name, and he was an American. And he told her that he had to do that in order to survive. So it can be many things. And I don't think that the aim to survive is selfishness, but it's self-love, you know. But it can also be just a radical act of freedom, that you decide that it's not nor your name, nor your language, nor your country define now and forever who you are, but they are just a starting point. And this is something that I insist a lot in regards to migrant people, that there is no one simple explanation of a really complex phenomenon, you know. And in the case of McKenna's brother, is someone who didn't look for that solution. It's just something that reality presented before him, and he just took it and went along with it, and that's how he became a different person.
Thank you. I think that's a beautiful place to end it. Thank you, Jay, for your questions. I'm glad your book's already in the mail. I just want to say thank you to the three of you. It has been truly an honor to have you. We have loved Yuri's work and Lisa's translations for many years. To have you it's a joy. Thank you to Spencer. Thank you to And Other Stories. Thank you to Spencer of Third Place Books. I should be clear. Lovely. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thanks to you, Piers. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Betina.
Thanks.
And all the people that.
Bye. Thank you to everybody.
Thank you.